1985, South Central Los Angeles. A 25-year-old man who cannot read a newspaper is sitting in a house with $3 million in cash stacked on a table. He did not inherit it. He did not win it. He made it in less than a year, selling a drug that most of America has not even heard of yet. His name is Ricky Donald Ross. The newspapers will call him Freeway Rick. The DEA will call him the biggest crack dealer in the history of Los Angeles. And the part of this story that nobody will want to talk about for another decade is the question that should have been obvious from the beginning. Where did a 25-year-old who could not read get access to an unlimited supply of pure Colombian cocaine at prices no one else on the West Coast could match? That question has an answer, and the answer does not start on any street corner. To understand how Rick Ross built what federal prosecutors would later estimate as a multi-hundred-million-dollar operation, you have to understand what Los Angeles looked like before crack existed. Not the Los Angeles of the movies, not palm trees and swimming pools, the other one, the one south of the 10 freeway. Rick grew up in Tay, a neighborhood in South Central. His mother worked hard. His family was not wealthy. And Rick had a problem that defined nearly everything about his early life. He could not read. Not slowly, not poorly. He could not read at all. He made it through high school without anyone teaching him. Think about what that means. Not about Rick, about the system that moved him through 12 years of education and never once stopped to ask why he could not decode a sentence on a page. He was good at tennis, genuinely good, good enough to earn a scholarship offer. And then someone found out he was illiterate, and the scholarship disappeared. That was the door closing. There was no second one. In the late 1970s, South Central was already hemorrhaging jobs. The factories that had drawn black families west during the Great Migration were shutting down or leaving. Firestone, Goodyear, General Motors. One by one, the plants closed. The freeways that crisscrossed the neighborhood, the ones that gave Rick his future nickname, had been built straight through black communities a generation earlier, demolishing homes and businesses to connect white suburbs to downtown. What was left behind was a neighborhood with no jobs, underfunded schools, and a generation of young men with nothing that looked like a future. That is the soil. Now here is the seed. Sometime around 1979 or 80, Rick Ross met a man who could get cocaine. Not the kind of connection most small-time dealers had, where you buy an ounce or two from someone who bought it from someone else. This was different. This was volume. And the prices were low, unusually low. Rick did not ask philosophical questions about the supply chain. He was 20 years old, and he had never had money. What he did next was not genius in the traditional sense. It was instinct, combined with desperation, combined with a mind that, despite being unable to read, could calculate numbers and systems faster than most people with a college degree. He learned to cook powder cocaine into rock. The chemistry is not complicated. Baking soda, water, heat. What comes out is a small, hard, smokable piece of cocaine that hits faster and harder than the powder form. And here is the part that changed everything. Powder cocaine was a rich person's drug. A gram cost $100 or more. But a rock of crack could be sold for $5, $10, $20. You did not need a Beverly Hills address to buy it. You needed $5 and a glass pipe. Rick understood what he had before anyone else in LA did. He did not just have a drug, he had a new market. And he had a supplier who could meet whatever demand he created. He started in his neighborhood and expanded fast, not by being the most violent, not by waging war on every corner. His model was closer to a franchise. He set up networks. He found people in different neighborhoods, gave them product at low cost, let them sell it, and took his share. He moved into Compton, Watts, Long Beach, and then beyond Los Angeles entirely. By the mid-1980s, Rick Ross was supplying dealers across the country. His operation touched cities from New Orleans to Cincinnati to Cleveland. The numbers are hard to verify precisely, but federal estimates later placed his total revenue somewhere north of $600 million. Even if you cut that in half for exaggeration, the figure is staggering. This was a man who could not read a street sign, running a distribution network that rivaled legitimate corporations. But there is a problem with this story the way it is usually told. The usual version goes like this. Smart kid from a rough neighborhood beats the odds, builds a criminal empire, gets caught, goes to prison. Rise and fall. Clean arc. Simple moral. The problem is that arc leaves out the most important character in the story. Because Rick Ross did not find his cocaine supply through some street-level hustle. His main connection was a man named Oscar Danilo Blandone. If you enjoy the kind of history that goes deeper than the obvious story, hit subscribe. Because what comes next is the part that changes everything you think you know about the crack epidemic. Blandone was not a gangster. He was not from Compton or Watts. He was from Nicaragua. He came from a wealthy family that had been close to the Somoza regime, the U.S.-backed dictatorship that ruled Nicaragua for decades. When the Sandinistas overthrew Somoza in 1979, Blandone and thousands of other Nicaraguan elites fled. Many of them ended up in the United States, and many of them wanted the Sandinistas gone. That desire connected them to the Contras, the right-wing rebel group that was trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. And the Contras had a problem. They needed money. Lots of it. The Reagan administration supported them politically and, for a time, financially. But when Congress passed the Boland Amendment in the early 80s, cutting off direct U.S. military aid to the Contras, the money pipeline tightened. What happened next is where this story crosses from crime into something much larger. According to Blandone's own later testimony, he began selling cocaine in the United States to raise money for the Contra cause. The cocaine came from Colombian suppliers through Central American routes. And one of his biggest customers, the man who moved more of his product than anyone else, was Rick Ross in south-central Los Angeles. Let that sit for a moment. A Nicaraguan exile with ties to a CIA-backed rebel group was selling cocaine to a black man in South Central, who then cooked it into crack and sold it to his own community. The money from those $5 rocks was flowing back through a chain that ended, in part, in the jungles of Central America, funding a covert war that Congress had specifically voted to stop funding. Rick did not know this. He did not know about the Contras. He did not know about the Boland Amendment. He did not know about the CIA. He knew Blandone had good product at good prices and that the supply never ran dry. That was enough. But the implications are enormous, because the question stops being about Rick Ross, the individual. The question becomes systemic. Did elements of the United States government, directly or through negligence, allow cocaine to flood black neighborhoods in order to fund an illegal war in Central America? The word allow is doing a lot of work in that sentence. There is a spectrum between actively orchestrating a drug epidemic and simply looking the other way while your assets sell cocaine. The truth, as far as anyone has been able to document it, falls somewhere in that uncomfortable middle. And that middle is where most people stop wanting to look. But the cocaine kept flowing, and the damage was not abstract. By the mid-1980s, crack had reshaped South Central Los Angeles in ways that are still visible today. The drug hit black communities with a speed and intensity that is hard to compare to anything else in American history. It was not a slow burn. It was an explosion. Families that had held together through decades of poverty, discrimination, and neglect came apart in months. Mothers who had raised children alone through the worst of the 70s were suddenly lost to addiction. Fathers disappeared. Children ended up in foster care or on the street. The crack house became a feature of the landscape, as common as the corner store. Violence followed the drug, not because crack itself causes violence, but because the money around it was enormous, and the legal system offered no protection to the people in the trade. Disputes were settled with guns. By the late 80s, the murder rate in South Central had reached levels that would have been classified as a public health emergency if it had happened in a white suburb. And then came the response. Not treatment, not investment, not jobs. The response was policing. The war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentencing, 3 strikes. The machinery of mass incarceration, which would eventually lock up more black men per capita than any system since slavery, was built in direct response to the crack epidemic. Rick Ross saw the money. What he did not see, or chose not to see, was what the money cost the people around him. He later said he thought he was providing opportunity, employment, a way out of poverty for people the system had abandoned. And, in a narrow, distorted sense, he was right. His operation employed hundreds of people, but the product they were selling was destroying the customers they were selling it to, and the neighborhoods they operated in were becoming war zones. Here is the question that has no clean answer, and the one worth putting in the comments if you have ever wrestled with it. Was Rick Ross a predator who exploited his own community for profit? Was he a product of a system that left him no legitimate path? Or was he something worse, a pawn in a game so large he never even saw the board? Drop your verdict below. For a channel like this one, that kind of real debate matters more than 1,000 empty comments. Because the next chapter of this story is about betrayal. And the betrayal came from the one direction Rick never saw coming. By the late 1980s, the pressure was building. The DEA knew who Rick Ross was. The LAPD knew. The federal government knew. They had been watching him for years. But taking him down was not simple. His operation was decentralized. His discipline was tight. And he had something most drug dealers did not have, a supplier who had his own protections. Because Blandon was not just a drug dealer, he was an intelligence asset. People in the United States government knew who he was and what he was doing. The extent of their knowledge, and whether it constituted approval, is one of the most contested questions in the entire story. But what is not contested is this. Blandon was allowed to operate for years in ways that a normal drug trafficker would not have been. And then the same government that had tolerated Blandon decided it needed Rick Ross in a cell. Blandon flipped. The man who had supplied Rick Ross with tons of cocaine, the man whose drug money had funded a covert war, became a paid informant and government witness. He helped set up Rick in a drug sting. Rick was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Read that again. The supplier, the man with CIA-adjacent connections, the man who brought the cocaine into the country in the first place, was not only free, but on the government's payroll. The dealer, the man from South Central who could not read, got life. The legal system called this justice. From the outside, it looked like something else entirely. Rick's sentence was later reduced on appeal, and he was eventually released. But the asymmetry of that outcome tells a story that no courtroom transcript can contain. The man who built the supply chain walked. The man who stood at the end of it, in the neighborhood that absorbed all the damage, went to prison. And for years, that was where the story stopped. A drug dealer got caught. The end. Move on. Then Gary Webb kicked the door open. Webb was a reporter at the San Jose Mercury News, not the New York Times, not the Washington Post, a regional paper in Northern California. In 1996, he published a series called Dark Alliance. The series laid out, in detail, the connections between the Contra support network, Blandon, the cocaine pipeline, and the crack epidemic in Los Angeles. The core claim was explosive, that the CIA, through its support of the Contras, had allowed cocaine to flow into American cities, and that this cocaine had fueled the crack epidemic that devastated black communities. The reaction was immediate and split down the middle. In black communities, the series confirmed what many people had suspected or believed for years. There were rallies, there was anger, there was a sense of vindication. The conspiracy theory that the government had put crack in black neighborhoods, a theory that had been dismissed as paranoid for a decade, suddenly had documents and names and dates behind it. In the mainstream press, the reaction was very different. The Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Times all published lengthy investigations attacking Webb's reporting. They did not dispute the basic facts. The connections between Blandon, the Contras, and the cocaine were real. What they challenged was the scope of the claim. They argued Webb had overstated the CIA's direct involvement. They argued his series implied a deliberate conspiracy rather than negligent oversight. The San Jose Mercury News buckled under the pressure. Webb's editors distanced themselves from the series. Webb was reassigned. His career was effectively over. He was found dead in 2004 with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The death was ruled a suicide. 2 gunshot wounds, a suicide. The coroner said it happens, and medically it does. But the detail became a symbol for people who believed the full story had never been told. Here is what happened after Webb was gone. In 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report. It was hundreds of pages long. Most of America did not read it. But the report confirmed that the CIA had maintained relationships with individuals and organizations involved in drug trafficking during the Contra operation. It confirmed that the agency had intervened to block law enforcement investigations that could have exposed these connections. It did not say the CIA invented crack or deliberately targeted black communities. But it confirmed that the agency knew drug money was flowing through its networks and chose to protect the operation over stopping the drugs. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the CIA's own report. And this is where the matryoshka opens to its smallest, most uncomfortable doll. Rick Ross, the illiterate kid from South Central, was never the architect of the crack epidemic. He was a tool. An effective, ambitious, ruthlessly efficient tool, but a tool nonetheless. The cocaine did not come from him. The money did not stay with him. The geopolitical machinery that made the supply possible was so far above his head that he did not even know it existed. The crack epidemic was not caused by one man. It was caused by a convergence of forces. The collapse of urban industry, the abandonment of black neighborhoods by federal policy, the availability of cheap cocaine from a covert war pipeline, and a legal response that chose incarceration over treatment. Rick Ross sat at the intersection of all these forces. He profited from them. He was destroyed by them. And the system that created the conditions for his rise was never indicted. Rick was released from federal prison in 2009. He came out to a world that had moved on. The crack era was history. The neighborhoods were different. Some had gentrified. Some had not recovered. He tried to build a legitimate life. He wrote a book. He gave talks. He sued the rapper who took his name. He became, in a strange way, a public figure whose main currency was his own story. But the story was never really his alone. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the kind that connects a single life to the machinery behind it, subscribe and hit the bell. Because this channel exists to pull buried stories to the surface, and the next one goes just as deep. There is a freeway in Los Angeles. It runs through the neighborhoods where Rick Ross grew up, where he sold crack, where families fell apart, where a generation was lost to addiction and prison. The freeway was built decades before crack existed. It was built by a government that decided black homes and black businesses were less important than a fast road to the suburbs. Rick got his name from that freeway. He used to sell on the ramps and overpasses. The nickname stuck. And the longer you look at this story, the more you realize the freeway was always the metaphor. A road built through a community by people who never lived there, carrying things that were never meant for the people underneath it. Rick Ross stood under that freeway. He caught what fell. And the people who built the road never had to answer for what it carried.